evening. Welcome back to our continuing series on the morning prayers. We're in the section of the prayers called Birchos HaShachar, the morning blessings. Prayer book is full of blessings. Near the end of the service, we have the Shemona Esrei, the 18 blessings, also known as the Amidah, the standing blessings. But at the beginning of the prayer book, very close to the time that we wake up in the morning, we also have a whole series of blessings that in some ways actually parallel the 18 blessings that we say later. So there's a certain symmetry over here. The beginning of the service has 18 blessings. We'll talk a little bit more about it as we go on. And at the end, or near the end, or the climax of our prayers also has the 18 blessings. And of course, nothing in general is by coincidence, certainly not something in a work that is so precise, that was composed by prophets, every word being measured and calculated. Certainly there's a very strong correlation between those two parts, the beginning and the end. So these are the Birchos HaShachar, the morning blessings. We already covered three of the morning blessings, the one that we say when we wash our hands. Before that, we said Moda Ani, the prayer in which we thank God for having restored our soul. That was a very brief reference to the gratitude we have for God for having given us back our soul, but we don't even mention God's name. That we discussed at great length as to why that's so. Then after we say that, that wasn't considered a blessing. A blessing has to have in it the words Baruch Atah, blessed are you, God, our God, and so on and so forth. So we had the first blessing was the one we recite for washing our hands. Excuse me. The second blessing we say whenever we leave the facilities, taking care of our bodily needs. We thank God for the way our bodily system works so efficiently. We're grateful for our health, in other words. Not just that we're alive, but that our body functions well. Then we say an expanded version of the Modani, in which we praise God for the soul, but we also discuss where the soul comes from and how it travels, its itinerary, as it were. And we're grateful for God, not just for our body, but for our soul as well, and the interplay, of course, between body and soul. After that, we go into the specific aspects of our physical existence after having awakened and recognizing that we're alive and that we're basically in good shape. We don't feel any pains or any aches. Everything is working fine. And of course you could ask the question, what about if things are not working fine? Do we still say these blessings? And the answer is yes, because these blessings are not just for our own individual and personal benefit, but we're grateful to God that these benefits do exist. And since other people have them, it does exist, we try to, quote unquote, plug into that energy. So on the contrary, someone who is deficient in these areas of health has even a greater need and a reason to say these blessings, because the blessings are part of a process where we channel God's energy into our own lives. And the more that the blessing eludes us, the more we have the need to channel it. Now, we're going to say a whole series of blessings, thanking God for everything from the alarm clock in the morning, so to speak. We'll get into that soon. Including our ability to open our eyes and to walk and to get dressed and have shoes and so on and so forth. We are going to focus on individual benefits, specific benefits. First, we thank God for life in general, our general well-being. Then we thank God for our particulars in terms of our well-being. Now, the ancient custom was that a person would say these blessings the minute that you experience them. So as soon as you open your eyes, you would say the blessing that thanks God for having open eyes. And likewise with the garments that you wear, you thank God for clothing you, and so on and so forth. Then the custom changed for two reasons. Number one, people, when they have these experiences first, their bodies might not be clean. first you open your eyes, you're not yet in a state of mind, or the bodily functions haven't yet been taken care of, so your body is still in a quote unquote unclean, whether it's physically unclean or ritually unclean state. So it's not proper to say these blessings where you invoke God's name. Secondly, there were many Jews, unfortunately, who were illiterate. We always had the phenomenon of Jews who were not lettered and they could not read these blessings, so it was a little bit awkward for them because they couldn't thank God for this. So a custom developed to transfer the recitation of these blessings to the synagogues. When people come to the synagogue for the morning service, the chazan, the one who leads the service, would say the blessings, and those who couldn't repeat those words would just answer Amen, Amen, as if they're agreeing with the blessing, which constitutes the saying of the blessing, as if they said it themselves. But there's another custom. The Chabad custom is somewhat like a bridge between those two different customs. The first custom emphasizes the need to be grateful immediately. In other words, if someone does you a favor today, and a week later you say, thank you so much, it's still gratitude, but it's lacking something. You have to be very, very immediate to really show that you appreciated what you got. So the first custom, the ancient custom, was very much consistent with that. As soon as you had the benefit, as soon as you opened your eyes, thank God for my open eyes. But to the synagogue, say it at home before you go to the synagogue. After washing your hands and taking care of your bodily needs, when you're physically and mentally and spiritually clean, you then say the blessings as close as you can to the time that you actually benefited from it. And then when you go to the synagogue, then you go to recite the balance of the prayers, not the morning blessings. And the reason for that is, as I just said, it's best to not delay expressing gratitude. In addition, the whole idea of these blessings, these are preliminary blessings. In Judaism, there's not just what you do, but what you do before you do it, and how you prepare for it. In some Hasidic communities, there's more emphasis placed on the preparations for the mitzvah than there is for the mitzvah itself. The mitzvah is almost anticlimactic. You put so much emphasis in preparing for it. So you don't want to delay. You want to be prepared. You don't want to allow the nighttime drowsiness and disengagement and your mind not functioning. You don't want to allow that to take over. You want to get out of that nighttime dream mode into reality. So you try to say those blessings as soon as you can. Now, as I just said a moment ago, that we're thankful to God, not just for life in general, but for the particulars. Because when can you really show that your gratitude is genuine? When you don't just say, thank you for everything, but when you're also, you individualize it. Thank you for this gift. Thank you for that gift. That doesn't mean that if you're just general, you're not grateful. It just means that your gratitude is not complete. And we're focusing now on making the gratitude complete. One way of looking at it is, there are two things for which a person has to show gratitude. Because there are two things that you get from the other. The other could be another person. It could be from God. When someone gives you a gift, they actually gave you two things. Number one, the very gesture of wanting to give you something, whatever it is, even if you don't need it. Someone brings you flowers, you don't care for flowers, but you're still grateful that they went out of their way to purchase the flowers. It was a gesture of goodwill. So you're grateful for their gesture, for their demonstration that they have positive feelings towards you, and you want to say thank you for that. It has nothing to do with what they gave you. It has to do with the idea, the gesture of giving you something. So you say, you acknowledge that. Thank you for the gesture. But then, if let's say they give you what you want, if you're a man, you probably want something in electronics. So, men like toys. So you're not just grateful for the gesture, you're grateful because you appreciate what they gave. So same thing with God. We're grateful to God that He makes the gesture of having a relationship with us, that He gives us anything, that He gives us life in general. That's the gesture. But then to show more profound gratitude, we thank Him for the specifics. We say thank you for this individual thing, and we show that every little thing that He gave us is meaningful to us, and we're grateful for it. As I mentioned before, what about someone who doesn't personally benefit from these things? Someone who can't see, can't talk about opening up his eyes to see. Someone who didn't get out of bed because whatever reason they're laid up in bed. Do they also say the blessing of applying their standing up and moving around? And the answer is there, as you could expect in Judaism, there are two opinions about that. But the prevailing opinion is that you do say it even if you're not directly a beneficiary of that particular gift that God gives, because God gives it to society as a whole, and since we're part of that society, we are considered to be beneficiaries of it. Also, a blind person, for example, can't see, but he can thank God that others could see, because if no one could see, God forbid, then it would impact the blind person as well. The Rebbe once explained that this is also true in the spiritual realm. Even if you don't feel spirituality, this is a common complaint that many people have. I don't feel the spirituality of the holiday, of the Shabbat, or whatever experience is supposed to be an uplifting one, an energizing one, a spiritual one. You don't feel it. Nevertheless, you have to acknowledge it, because as I explained before, on the contrary, the fact that you don't feel it means that you need to acknowledge it even more, because that will be the channel to indeed begin to experience it. The more you don't have something, the more you need to work at getting it, which is common sense in every area of life. If a person, God forbid, is denied good health, what does the person say? Well, I don't have good health, so why should I call the doctor? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. You don't have good health, you do something about it, you call the doctor. Well, if you don't have the experience, the spiritual experience, you do something about it, and the doing is the expression of praise to God for these energies, trying to plug into them. As I said at the very outset, in the morning blessings there are a total of 18, plus a 19th one that was added. This is how many sources put it. 19th one is where you thank God for giving the weary strength. That was added on later. And that parallels the Amidah, the Shemona Esrei, which also originally had 18 with the 19th added on. The 19th one was the one we asked God to take care of those enemies who are informers and try to destroy us. That was a reaction to a problem that Jews had historically with groups of people that were trying to undermine Jewish existence in Israel. So they made a special blessing to ask God to get rid of those impediments. So the same way over here in the morning blessings, we also added on a 19th one, which dealt with a new situation, giving strength to the weary, because as generations progressed, people and the exile became more and more intense. There was a greater sense of helplessness and weariness, towards which we have to ask God to help us and give us strength. The truth is that there are only a total of 18, even with that blessing. The reason why they say there was 19, a total of 19, is we're counting a blessing that we recite before going to bed at night. And that's an interesting concept, because that's the night before. But in Jewish tradition, based on the biblical account of creation, Vayhi Erev, Vayhi Boker, there was evening, and then there was morning, Yom Echad, one day, or there was evening and morning, there was 2 days. So the day in Judaism begins the night before, not at midnight, but at nightfall. So nightfall tonight is tomorrow already. We consider tonight, this class is being broadcast on a Tuesday night. This is already Wednesday, because it's already after nightfall. So, spiritually speaking, it also works that way. That when a person goes to sleep, and they go to sleep reciting that blessing in which we entrust our soul with God, that is the beginning of the next day. Because when a person goes to sleep like a mensch, he wakes up like a mensch. Mensch is French for a decent person who knows what the score is. He knows what life is all about. So when you go to sleep, not just plopping down in bed, which very often we feel like doing, but you talk to God and entrust your soul to God and make a good resolution for the next day, you wake up the next morning energized, so your moda'ani is with more flavor and more intensity, and likewise all the other prayers. So there are a total of 19 prayers. It's interesting that the number 18, which is the foundation, is a recurrent theme. There are 3 other prayers that have 18 associated with them. Later on we'll see there's a section called Yehi Chvod. It's a prayer that has 18 verses in it that are collected from different places. Then we have Oz Yashir, the song the Jews sang when they crossed the sea, where God's name is mentioned 18 times. And there's another prayer later on after the Amida Uval Etzion that has God's name mentioned 18 times. So 18 is a recurrent theme, and it's certainly not a coincidence. What is the significance of 18? Well, if it has God's name 18 times, God's name has 4 letters, that's 72, and it says that 72 is the ultimate permutation of God's name. It represents the most intense godly energy, and that the fact that we have this 18 indicated at the beginning of our prayers and at the climax points to an interesting parallel. They're not really parallel in the full sense of the word, because when you wake up in the morning, even if you went to sleep with the right prayer, you're still a novice. You're still not capable of experiencing the full complement of spiritual energy. Your soul, to use an biblical expression, is in your nostrils. It means your soul hasn't yet spread throughout your body. You're not yet capable of mustering all of your spiritual faculties. But precisely because you're not capable of getting up, pulling yourself up by your own energy, you need divine energy. You need the 72. The 72 is a very important number. Actually, 72 is the numerical value of the word chesed, kindness. You need a lot of divine energy and kindness to give you the ability to go forward in your spiritual journey for that day. When you reach the Shemona Esrei, the climax of the prayers, you are then ready for it. You don't need the special divine assistance to pull you up. You then have become regimented, and you're now able to receive whatever energy, the 72, the maximum amount of energy based on your own spiritual journey. This, it is said, parallels the Exodus from Egypt, and 50 days later, the receiving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. When they left Egypt, they had to be pulled out of Egypt. They were in no state to be liberated. They were in the dumps. They had reached the nadir of imperfection. It says that there were 50 gates of imperfection, of impurity. They had descended to the 49th. If they had gone to himself. So Passover night is the highest revelation. It says God revealed himself. He didn't do it through angels, through messengers. He himself was fully revealed, but they weren't ready for it. That's precisely why he had to reveal himself, because they were not ready for it. But then when 49 days of counting passed and preparation and refinement, and they reach the 50th day, the same revelation of God occurs, but this time they are ready for it. They have generated it. They're ready and they're receptive. So at the beginning of our journey and at the end of the journey, those are the two most powerful parts of the journey. The beginning, because God has to schlep us out of wherever we were, and the end, because we have reached the pinnacle. Now we start the blessing itself. Blessed are you, God our God, King of the universe. We already had a class, we went through this. I'm going to discuss this very briefly. Blessed, the Hebrew word baruch, which we translate as blessed, has three translations. Number one, blessed. Number two, it's related to a Hebrew word, brecha, which is a pool or a reservoir. Number three, it comes from another Hebrew word, havracha, which is to extend something downward. To take a vine, let's say, that's in the ground, and extend the vine downward into the ground and plant it in the ground to grow another vine. Excuse me, that's called havracha, the same root as the word bracha. So what is a blessing? A blessing is where you take the pool of positive energy, of blessing. So all three translations come together. You take the pool of positive energy, which is what a blessing is, and you extend it downward, because God allocates certain good for us. That's what happens on Rosh Hashanah. God decides how much blessing we are going to receive. But yet, you can go through a year and not get any of that blessing that was allocated because there were some blockages in the pipeline. There were some obstacles that didn't allow the energy to come down through all the different levels to enter into your own physical existence or spiritual personality. So what happens as a result of that blockage, you need to get some way of channeling that energy down into yourself. That's what a bracha is. By saying these words, we're channeling the blessing from you. You is talking to God directly, that God's essence that doesn't have a name. Then we say God, which means God's name. The four letters of God's name represent four different grades, four different steps through which God's energy descends until Elokeinu, our God. But that word also means our power. It becomes our energy. It's internalized within us. And then once it's internalized within us, we can then say God is the king of the whole world. We can then allow some of that energy to be diffused and spread out to affect the whole world. So every time we say a blessing, what we're actually doing is bringing God down from a higher perch into our own consciousness, and through that spreading it to the whole world. But that's in general, but specifically you look at each blessing and look at its individual character. If, let's say, we're in need of healing, and you say a bracha that involves healing, then of course you're channeling God's energy that relates to healing. And whatever the specific blessing is, that's what the channel that you're creating through that blessing. So, now that we know what the first words are, blessed are you, God our God, King of the universe, that this is our way of channeling God's energy, what are we channeling it into? Well, the balance of this blessing is a very interesting one, very strange. Who grants the rooster the understanding to distinguish between day and night. In the olden days, they didn't have alarm clocks, unless you had kids. But if you didn't have kids, you had a rooster. You know, the famous story in the Talmud, Rabbi Akiva was traveling with his rooster, and then a fox came or a wolf and devoured it, and he said everything God does is for the best. It's a whole story that's not really, now is not the time to go into that, but that was a common thing, that if you were someone who wanted to make sure to get up in time so you could study Torah early and say your prayers in time, you would have a rooster. So we're grateful to God because the first thing that happens in the morning is waking up. And when we realize we woke up in the right time, we say, oh, the rooster woke us up, so we're grateful for that. It sounds simple enough, but it's still problematic. Why do we need to thank God for knowing the difference between day and night? Who needs a rooster to tell you the difference between day and night? And why would you praise God for something so insignificant as that? There must be some deeper meaning. Especially when the word used for rooster, sechvi, is a very uncommon word. And it's only used, this is the only place where it's used. I don't know any other place in any Jewish text. I can't speak for every Jewish text, but this is a very unusual term. There are other words used for a rooster. Tarnagol is the common word. So there are those early commentators, medieval commentators, who say that the word, while it does mean rooster, it's used metaphorically, and it really refers to day is not just the physical day. Day means the light of day, the ability to see things clearly, to know what's right and what's not right. Night being the dark, where our vision is impaired and our judgment is clouded, and we can go in the wrong path. And when we wake up in the morning, the first thing we have to do is to be able to make the right choices. That's what life is all about. Because whatever we're going to do, there's always going to be two ways of doing it, two or more ways. And it could be that only one of them is correct, and you have to know how to choose the right path. You need a certain amount of discernment, a certain amount of intelligence, and we don't always know how to make that distinction between right and wrong. Now, if this is the middle of the day, when all of our faculties are working at full speed, then we're much more capable of making those choices. But when we wake up in the morning, we are physically in a state of confusion. We're half not here. Half of us is here. Half of us is still in the world, the sleep, in the dream world. So we have to now invoke that power that God gives us to be able to distinguish between day and night metaphorically. Because what is a state of sleep? In a state of sleep, we don't have our faculties functioning. But what makes things even worse is the dream state. What is a dream? A dream is, you can say, well, not dreaming is less consciousness than dreaming. That's true. But dreaming is a distorted consciousness. And that's not a good thing. One of the reasons the exile, galut, exile is referred to as a dream in the book of Psalms, is because it's distorted. When you're in exile, you're alienated from your home base, physically and spiritually. And when you're not in your home base, you're disoriented. And that's what the dream state is in. So when you wake up in the morning, you're still half asleep, that you're still in a dream state, physically, mentally, and spiritually, and therefore you have to channel that energy to be able to make the distinction between right and wrong. And that's why the Torah commands us, we just read it in the Torah, you should know the difference between life and death and good and evil. Choose life, choose good. Does the Torah have to tell us that we should choose life? The answer is yes, because when we're in a sleep state, we could sometimes choose the opposite of life because we're not yet awake enough. Some people could be wide awake in every other area of life, but when it comes to morality, they could be in a deep sleep. So we're not just talking about someone early in the morning when their faculties are not working. We could be talking about someone in the middle of the day, someone who's brilliant in their own respective field, but when it comes to morality, there's a big cloud that they're in, and they need to invoke God's energy to give them this ability to make the discern. There's a question, I haven't found anyone asking this question. That doesn't mean they haven't asked it, but I didn't find anyone who addresses this directly, so we're going to try to understand this. The Hebrew word here that is used for intelligence, to be able to know the difference between day and night, whether it's the rooster, whether it's the heart, is the Hebrew word bina. Nosein l'sechvi bina. He gave the sechvi, the rooster or the heart, a subject, understand it well, elaborate on it, articulate it, draw inferences from it. That's what bina is generally understood to mean. And it uses the term bina, and also it talks about discerning, distinguishing between day and night. The problem is that in Hebrew, the faculty in Jewish sources, the faculty that gives us the power of discernment is the faculty of das, which they usually translate as knowledge, but it means the power of discernment. And what am I basing that on? One source of that is Saturday night, when Shabbat is over, we make Havdalah. We recite a prayer in which we talk about how God separates between the Shabbos, the Sabbath, the holy day, and the weekday. We between light and darkness, between Israel and the nations. Now that prayer is said over a cup of wine. But that's the second time we recite it. It's recited the first time in our evening prayers. The evening prayer, we have a paragraph where we say to God, God gave us the ability to make the discernment between Shabbos and the weekday. Which part of the prayer? It's in the Amidah, the 18 blessings. Which one of the 18? In the one in which we ask God for das. Atachone la'adam das. You graciously give a person das. So the Talmud asks, why is this prayer in which we speak about the separation between Shabbos and the weekday inserted in the prayer for knowledge, for das? So the Talmud uses an expression in one place. It says, if there's no das, how could you separate? The ability to separate requires das, discernment. An animal cannot discern between a expensive piece of clothing and a rag, and he'll step on both, not caring about the value of the silk garment that he's destroying. It doesn't have that das. A human being has das, could separate between the two. So we see that the power of separation that we have in our mind, in our heart, comes from das. Bina is more of an intellectual. A brilliant scientist could be brilliant in his field, but not be able to make distinctions between different moral positions. So why does it use the term bina in reference to separation between night and day, light and darkness? The second question, which I think is the key to answering the first question, is that in Hebrew there are two words, synonyms, for separation or discernment. One is lehavchin, which is used here, and the other one is lehavdil. And in most places they're used in combination, they're used together, they're synonyms. But there's no such thing as a synonym in Hebrew, a real synonym. I suspect that in English also, synonyms really have different nuances. If you look in an unabridged dictionary, they'll tell you what each synonym means that distinguishes it from the other one, talking about distinguishing things. So we have two different words for distinguishing things. So generally speaking, they are understood the same way. But I have a feeling, I have a sneaky suspicion that there's a difference between lahavchin, which is used here, and that requires bina, and havdalah associated with das, because there are two different types of discernment that require two different faculties. This is just conjecture. I haven't found a source for this yet. Let's look at where we use the word havdalah and where we use the term havchana. Havdalah we use, as I just mentioned, the Saturday night. It's a holy day, and we're going into a weekday. So we say to God, God, we appreciate that this is a special day, and we know the difference between Shabbos and a weekday. You know, the key to showing respect for someone is to know what they are that distinguishes them from someone else. You see a person who has an MD, you treat him as a doctor, not the way you would treat someone else in the area of medicine. So you have that awareness of the difference between one thing and another. Where do we find the term havchana, lahavchin? It's the same root, to discern. The one place where it's used very emphatically is in Jewish law of marriage, remarriage. A woman loses her husband either through death or through a divorce, and she wants to remarry. She has to wait 3 months, 91 days, till she remarries. Why is that? Because of havchana. In case she is impregnated, we want to make sure we know who is the real father, because if it's less than 3 months that the remarriage takes place and she has a child, now that child might be born in the 7th month, as preemie, So then the father is the second husband, but it might be the 9th month, and the father is the first husband, and that would pose many problems of identity. And in Jewish law, it's very important to know your identity in terms of who you can marry, who you can't marry, and so on and so forth. Also, in Jewish law, if you strike your parent and injure blood, that's a capital crime in Judaism. In the olden days, when they had capital punishment on the books, it was hardly ever meted out, but it was considered to be on par with murder. Well, it makes a difference if it's your father or not. If it's not your father, then you're a little bit safer, or a lot safer. So that is the term havchana. You have to know who is the father. So in what way are we using that? We're not trying to separate between two things. We're trying to trace the source. Mm-hmm. We want to know, what is the source of this child? Is the source husband A, or the source is husband B? I'll give you another example in a moral sense. There's a famous story of Rabbi Nachum of Chernobyl. Most people know Chernobyl when the nuclear plant there imploded. But Hasidim know of Chernobyl. 2 centuries before that, one of the greatest Hasidic masters, he was a senior colleague of the Alter Rebbe, Reb Shneir Zalman, the founder of the Chabad movement, and he was known as a very holy and righteous man, and very poor. And it wasn't because he didn't have a lot of money, it's because he gave it all away. His Hasidim would bring him money, and he would take it and distribute it to charity, and would hardly leave anything for his own household. And there was a certain point in time when I think I don't know if he had to marry off a child, and he needed money, and he had no money. And one day, one of his followers, who was a man of means, comes and gives him 300 rubles, which was a hefty sum in those days. And shortly after that, a man comes to the rabbi and starts crying to him that he has to marry off his daughter. And the rabbi asks him, how much do you need? He said, 300 rubles. So he took the 300 rubles and gave it to him. And then he had second thoughts. He says, you know what? Maybe I should have, distributed it to a lot of people. Giving all of it to one person, I should have split it up into many parts. There's so many needy people. Give this one 20 rubles, this one 10 rubles. And maybe keep 10, 20 for myself. Then he said, you know what? I have to determine and discern where my second thought came from, where my first thought came from. My first thought must have come from my good inclination. Mm-hmm. It was selfless. It was immediate. I wasn't thinking about myself. I was just thinking about the needy person. The second thought, I included myself in it. Give to everyone, give away most of it, but a little bit for myself. I said, that was not my initial thought. That was a reaction to my willingness to do something selfless. So the Yetzer Hara, the evil impulse comes, or the ego comes and says, no, 1 second. I have a better way of giving tzedakah. You distribute it evenly. In other words, if I would have thought of that originally, give it to 10 different people, that would have been different. But it came as a reaction. So the term that's used is havchana, the same term used over here. He made a decision to give 300 rubles. Then he said, maybe I should split it up. And he had to figure out, where does that second thought come from? What's the source? What's the father of that second thought? Is the father the good impulse or the evil impulse? So that's where we use the term havchana, lahavchin. When you're living in a twilight zone, in that case, you don't know who the father is. You have 2 thoughts. You don't know which thought is coming from which direction. What's the father of that thought? You have to have bina. It's not discernment. Discernment, as I'll soon explain, is when you have 2 things that are very close to each other. You have to still be able to show they're very different. But when you have 2 things that are opposites, and you don't know which is the source of your behavior, you need bina. You need a deep understanding of human nature. You have to have understanding, or biology in the case of the father. You have to know. You have to know clearly where things are. That's not das. Das is Shabbos and the weekdays. There's nothing bad about weekdays. Weekdays is not bad. Or we say between Israel and the nations. The nations are not discussed here in the terms of they're bad. They're just as human as us. They have the same bodies, the same of everything, but yet they're different. That requires das. That's more than just intellectual bina. Bina is more of knowing information. Das is having it's a more subtle thing. To look at things, even light and darkness. We say in the Havdalah, God gives us the power to discern between light and darkness. Darkness is not necessarily a negative thing. God created darkness for a good reason. That's when we rest. That's when we're rejuvenated. So light and darkness is good and evil, good and bad. It can be understood as two different functions, and we need das to understand the differences. There are some people who, on a very simple level, don't know the difference between day and night. They don't have a schedule. They're all tzimish. They're all confused. They don't have any boundaries and borders. So it's not that discernment means, Havdalah means that you take two things that might be the same, equally valid, and you show the difference between them. Shabbos and the weekdays, they're equally valid. God is as much interested in how we live in the weekdays as he is in how we live on Shabbos. But yet, a discerning person knows there's a difference. There's a different approach to God in the weekdays as there is on Shabbos. So, to summarize the point, that when we have to go through the confusion, the twilight zone, when we wake up in the morning, we need bina, we need profound understanding. When we're dealing with two things that are both legitimate and both positive, but we have to sense there's a difference between them, because if we treat them both the same, we're going to not react to them, then you need Havdalah, then you need knowledge. A simpler answer to the question I found in a discourse of the Mittler Rebbe, the second Chabad Rebbe, where he says that, he quotes Ethics of the Fathers, that you can't get to Das without Bina. Person can't be a discerning person who doesn't understand anything. So you really start off with Bina, and from Bina it goes to Das. So that's a simpler answer, that what this text is saying, that God gives us Bina, and it's a shorthand for saying Bina and the Das that it engenders, that leads to the separation. Just another example, Adam and Eve. They ate of the tree of knowledge. What changed? Before Adam and Eve ate of that tree, there was no such thing as a difference between the upper part of the body and the lower part. They didn't have to wear clothing. Every aspect of the body was functioned as an organ that was there to serve God. They had no das. They had no way of discerning. They were both equal. They got knowledge. All of a sudden, they said, "You know what? They're both there for a good purpose, but there's a difference between them. The upper part of the body is exposed. The lower part of the body has to be covered." So das took something that was equal and showed that it was difference. Bina takes something that is different, but you're so clouded that you don't know that they're different. So you need Bina to know that this is right and this is wrong. That's my conjecture about this, which interestingly has some ramifications for the differences between men and women. I left this for the end because this is a very radical statement that I'm going to make now, that men and women are different. But what is it that they're different about? So the Talmud says that women have greater bina than men. That's why a woman's bat mitzvah is a year earlier than a man's bar mitzvah. because she has greater knowledge, greater bina, not knowledge, but understanding. But those are not accurate translations. Men, on the other hand, have more das. It says women are weaker in das than men, stronger in bina than men. A woman is not ever clouded. She intuitively knows right from wrong. That's the natural state of the woman. A woman is much more intuitive. She has bina. Part of bina is intuition. Whereas a woman does not have the power of das, discernment, when there are two equal things that look equal, and you still have to show that they're different. That is something that men have a stronger ability in that area. So that just explains why in this blessing we emphasize bina, lahavchin, rather than das and lahavdil. In Kabbalah we're told that the word sechvi is a reference to an angel, that this rooster, it means a rooster, but the rooster doesn't have any knowledge whatsoever. It's the angel, Gabriel, and there's a whole Kabbalistic explanation which we won't get into, that gives the rooster the message, relays the message that he should start to crow as a way of separating between night and day. Night is judgment, day is kindness. So when we're thanking God, that God gives the angel the knowledge to prompt a physical manifestation of the transition from judgment, which is harsh, to chesed, to kindness, which is pleasant. That's what the day is. The day shines, it's pleasant. So we're thanking God for that power to make that transition. So God willing, we'll continue. I don't know if we'll do one class for every one of these 18 blessings, but this was the first one of them, and it's the most enigmatic, so we